There is a form of strength that the world does not recognize because it does not announce itself. It does not stand on platforms. It does not accumulate followers. It does not assert itself through volume or visibility or the acquisition of things that can be measured by the eye. It is the strength of the soul that has learned to wait upon God without collapsing under the weight of what has not yet come. It is a strength that is forged not in moments of triumph, but in the long, quiet, unremarkable hours of faithfulness, when nothing appears to be changing and no one appears to be watching. And yet, according to the testimony of Scripture, it is among the most formidable powers that a human being can possess. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 31 declares, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint." The structure of this promise is deliberate and must be read carefully. It does not begin with flying. It does not begin with soaring above difficulty. It begins with waiting. The waiting is not a preliminary condition to be endured before the real power arrives. The waiting is the means through which the power comes. The renewal of strength is not given apart from the waiting. It is given through it. And the one who waits upon the Lord is not simply marking time until circumstances shift. She is being reconstituted from the inside out, receiving a strength that is not her own, drawn from a source that does not deplete. Before any exploration of this subject proceeds, it must be established clearly what is meant by spiritual power. The Scriptures do not define power as the world defines it. Power in the biblical sense is not control over outcomes. It is not the ability to command one's environment or force circumstances into submission. The Apostle Paul, writing in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, records the words of the Lord spoken to him directly. "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." Divine strength perfected in human weakness. This is the paradox at the center of all biblical spirituality. The power of God does not flow through human capability. It flows through human surrender, through emptied hands, through hearts that have reached the end of their own resources and have found that God was there all along, waiting to be their sufficiency. The woman who waits then is not a woman who lacks power. She is a woman in whom a particular kind of power is being cultivated, a power that is invisible to the casual observer, but that registers in the courts of heaven with a weight that far exceeds the passing commendations of the world. Number one, waiting in Scripture is not passivity. It is active, deliberate trust exercised in the absence of visible confirmation. The Hebrew word most often translated as wait in the Old Testament carries within it the connotation of binding together, of intertwining, of a cord being wrapped around a fixed point. To wait upon the Lord is to bind oneself to Him, to refuse to let go even when the hands grow tired and the reasons for holding on are no longer visible to the eye. Psalm 62 verse 5 expresses this with striking clarity. "My soul, wait thou only upon God, for my expectation is from Him." David is not speaking to his circumstances. He is speaking to his own soul. He is commanding the deepest part of himself to remain anchored, to resist the pull of despair, to fix its expectation not upon people, not upon events, not upon visible changes, but upon God alone. This is not the language of passivity. This is the language of warfare. The soul that must be commanded to wait is a soul under pressure, a soul being tempted to move, to act prematurely, to take matters into its own hands. And the act of commanding it to remain still before God is an exercise of spiritual authority over one's own interior life. The woman who waits in this manner is not doing nothing. She is doing something profoundly demanding. She is choosing, as moment by moment, to trust a God she cannot see over circumstances she can. She's holding her ground against the internal voices that tell her she has been forgotten. She is maintaining her expectation in a direction that the world considers foolish. And in doing so, she is exercising a kind of spiritual strength that many who appear far more active and productive have never developed. Number two, the Scriptures present endurance not as a passive trait, but as a spiritual discipline that produces measurable and eternal results. James chapter 1 verses 3 and 4 state, "Knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience, but let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing." The trying of faith is not accidental, it is purposeful. And the patience that it produces is not merely the ability to tolerate delay. It is a completeness, a wholeness, a state of being in which the soul lacks nothing of what it needs to stand before God in maturity. This is extraordinary language. The end result of patience having its perfect work is that the believer becomes perfect and entire, wanting nothing. Not wanting nothing in the sense of having no desires, but wanting nothing in the sense of lacking nothing essential. The soul has been so thoroughly formed by the process of enduring that it has arrived at a place of spiritual completeness, and this completeness was not produced by the rival of the desired outcome. It was produced by the faithfulness that was maintained while the outcome was still absent. The woman who endures a long season of waiting without abandoning her faith, without growing bitter against God, without surrendering to the lie that she has been discarded, is undergoing a formation that cannot be achieved any other way. Endurance is not a lesser virtue. According to James, it is the very mechanism by which spiritual wholeness is achieved. Number 3, the account of Hannah, preserved in the first book of Samuel, stands as one of the most sustained portraits of faithful waiting in all of Scripture. Hannah desired a child. The Lord had closed her wombs. Year after year she went up to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, and year after year she returned without the answer she sought. She was provoked by her rival. She was misunderstood by the priest. She was observed weeping and praying with such intensity that Eli thought she was drunk. And yet Hannah did not stop going to the house of the Lord. She did not abandon her prayers. She did not redirect her petition to another source. She continued to bring her anguish before God with a persistence that was not born of stubbornness, but of deep and abiding trust. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 15 records her words to Eli, "I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord." The pouring out of the soul is not a casual act. It is a total expenditure. It is the emptying of everything before God with nothing held back, nothing sanitized, nothing concealed. And when the answer finally came, when Samuel was born and consecrated to the Lord, Hannah's prayer of thanksgiving in chapter 2 reveals the depth of spiritual understanding that had been formed in her during the years of waiting. She did not simply rejoice over the child. She proclaimed the sovereignty of God over all of life and death, over poverty and wealth, over exaltation and humiliation. She had learned things about God in the furnace of delay that she could never have learned in the comfort of immediate provision. And those lessons were not private. They were recorded in the scriptures for every generation that would follow. Number 4, the example of Anna the prophetess offers a different dimension of the same truth. And Anna, described in Luke chapter 2, verses 36 through 38, was a widow of great age who had been married 7 years before her husband died. Yet she then lived as a widow until she was 84, departing not from the temple but serving God with fastings and prayers night and day. The text gives no indication that Anna was waiting for a specific personal outcome. She was not praying for a new husband. She was not petitioning for restoration of what had been lost. She was simply present, faithful, devoted, steady in the house of God decade after decade, serving in a manner that drew no public attention and earned no earthly reward. And then the moment arrived. The infant Christ was brought into the temple, and Anna recognized him. She gave thanks to the Lord and spoke of him to all that looked for redemption in Jerusalem. The spiritual power of Anna was not displayed in a dramatic miracle or a public demonstration of authority. It was displayed in recognition. Either she saw what others could not see because she had spent her life in the kind of proximity to God that sharpens the spiritual senses. Her decades of quiet waiting had not been wasted. They had been preparation for a moment of such significance that only a soul refined by years of faithful devotion could have perceived it. Number 5, the account of Ruth before her union with Boaz reveals the power of obedience exercised in obscurity. Ruth was a Moabite widow who chose to follow her mother-in-law Naomi back to Bethlehem. She had no guarantee of provision, no promise of marriage, no assurance that her faithfulness would be rewarded in any tangible way. She simply chose to go. She chose to stay. She chose to work in the fields, gleaning behind the reapers, laboring under the sun in a foreign land among people who did not know her. Ruth chapter 2 verse 11 records the words of Boaz, who had been told all that Ruth had done for her mother-in-law. It hath fully been showed me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, and how thou hast left thy father and thy mother, and the land of thy nativity, and art come unto a people which thou knewest not heretofore. Ruth's faithfulness had been observed, not by her own effort to be seen, but by the quiet testimony of a life lived in steady, unremarkable obedience. She was not performing for an audience. She was gleaning in a field, and yet her conduct carried a weight that preceded her into rooms she had never entered and conversations she had never heard. The spiritual power of Ruth was not dramatic, it was consistent. It was the power of a woman who did what was right without knowing where it would lead, who served without guarantee, who waited without manipulating the outcome. And it was precisely this kind of character that made her ready for what God had prepared. Number 6, the life of David, though he was a man, provides a parallel that illuminates the nature of spiritual formation through delay. David was anointed king by Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 16. He was a young man when the oil was poured over his head, and yet years passed before he sat upon the throne. In those intervening years, he was hunted by Saul, driven into the wilderness, forced to live in caves, surrounded by danger, and pressed to the very edge of his endurance. Psalm 13 records his cry during one of these seasons. How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord? Forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? David did not pretend that the waiting was easy. He did not mask his frustration with spiritual platitudes. He brought his questions directly to God. And yet, in the very same psalm, he concludes, "But I have trusted in thy mercy. My heart shall rejoice in thy salvation. I will sing unto the Lord, because he hath dealt bountifully with me." The movement from anguish to trust, from complaint to worship, is not a denial of the pain. It is a triumph over it. It is the spiritual power of a soul that refuses to allow present suffering to define the character of God. Number 7, power, as defined by Scripture, is steadfastness rather than visibility. The world measures power by what can be seen, by influence, by reach, by results that can be quantified. But the Scriptures measure power differently. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 58 says, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord." Steadfastness is listed here as the primary posture of the faithful believer. Not advancement, not promotion, not breakthrough. Steadfastness, the refusal to be moved from the place where God has set one's feet. The woman who remains steadfast in a season of waiting is not powerless. She is unmovable, and the Scriptures declare that her labor, even the labor of waiting itself, is not in vain. It registers in a realm that the eye cannot see and that the world does not acknowledge, but that God himself receives and remembers. Number 8, obedience exercised in obscurity carries eternal weight. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17 declares, "For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, ere worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory." The affliction is real. Paul does not deny it, but he places it on a scale against something far heavier, an eternal weight of glory that is being produced by the very affliction that seems so burdensome in the present. The season of obscurity, the years of unseen faithfulness, the prayers offered in empty rooms, the obedience maintained when no one is watching, these are not lost. They are accruing weight in a dimension that will outlast every visible achievement this age has to offer. Number 9, Waiting deepens dependence on God in a manner that prosperity and fulfillment often cannot. When everything is going well, the soul can sustain itself on its own resources. But when the well runs dry, when the provision does not come, when the answer does not arrive, the soul is driven to a depth of dependence that it would never have chosen voluntarily. And it is in that depth that the most intimate knowledge of God is found. Psalm 42, verses 1 and 2, express this longing with striking beauty. As the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O God. My soul thirsteth for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? This thirst was not produced by abundance. It was produced by absence. The psalmist was cut off from the house of God, separated from the place of worship, surrounded by enemies who mocked his faith. And in that desolation, his soul reached for God with an intensity that comfort could never have generated. The woman who waits and finds her thirst for God, increasing rather than diminishing, is discovering something that many who have received their desires quickly have never known. She is discovering that God himself is the reward, not merely the giver of rewards. She is learning what the psalmist Asaph confessed in Psalm 73, verse 25. Whom have I in heaven but thee? And there is none upon earth that I desire beside thee. This is the confession of a soul that has been refined by waiting until everything extraneous has been stripped away and only God remains. Let it be said clearly that the frustration of waiting is legitimate. The ache of unfulfilled longing is not a spiritual failure. The tears shed in seasons of delay are not evidence of weak faith. God does not despise the cry of a heart that says, "Oh, how long?" He receives it, he holds it, and he continues his quiet sovereign work in the life that has entrusted itself to his keeping. The spiritual power of a woman who waits is not the power of one who has conquered her circumstances. It is the power of one who has refused to be conquered by them. It is the power of a soul that remains anchored to the character of God when every visible reason for that anchoring has been removed. It is the power of faithfulness that outlasts urgency, of trust that survives confusion, of worship that persists in the dark. And the word of the Lord gathers this entire truth into a single verse. Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. The power is in the not fainting. And the God who sustains that power is faithful to complete what he has begun.